Good morning, Mr. Sakellarios. Thank you for spending time with us on our program, and thank you for agreeing to talking with us. You've been studying Eastern traditions and philosophies, as well as Western accounts of reincarnation and life after death. You've become convinced that reincarnation is a real phenomenon. I must ask the obvious: do we live on Earth multiple times?
Well, everything I've read from the sources that I trust, both the Western and the Eastern, say yes. And not only that, but it's taken for granted. I mean, it's the ABCs really of spirituality. And this is really bottom line why I'm going public with it, is that the higher teachings are really not intelligible until you get some of these basics. And we in the West, we have lost even the basics. It's like having lost addition and subtraction. Well, how could we expect to do any higher math without just those simple things? So reincarnation is just one of the simple building blocks in the foundation.
I hear you, and that leads me to my next question. You became interested in spiritual concepts in general and past life research in particular very early on. Why do you think how it is that we've lost interest in the West generally, as you just said?
Well, there's two streams, and the first, of course, is traditional Christianity. And that's a long story. I'm not a deep student of this, but apparently, I don't know if his name is pronounced Origen or Origen, but one of the early church fathers taught reincarnation. He taught the pre-existence of the soul. That was the hinge point, that those Vedantic teachings turned around. And that was made anathema. And it was some kind of a political intrigue. It was not even a spiritual person that did it. It was like Emperor Justinian and his wife, that removed it. And ever since then, the people that had the higher teachings of Christianity were made into the heretics, and they were persecuted. And instead, there was kind of a light version, Christianity elements that was substituted. And that's what we have today. So that's one way that reincarnation was removed, but you can see little bits and pieces of it still in there if you look for it. And there's any number of people that have studied reincarnation and popularized it that have pointed those out. The other one is materialism, because clearly reincarnation is not compatible with philosophical materialism. So it has to be shoved under the rug, and ignored and marginalized. So I have really focused my own public work more on materialism than on Christianity. There's other people that have focused on that. So I've just focused on materialism, but both of those two forces, which are really opposed to each other, are both opposed to reincarnation.
So that's interesting. If I get you right, you're saying that Christianity and Eastern concepts were at one point not so far removed from each other.
Yeah, well, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish rabbi, and at his birth, according to the astrological configuration, 3 spiritual masters from the East came and acknowledged his future status. The 3 wise men, those weren't wise guys, those weren't like, financial figures. Those were spiritual teachers, from the East. So you're really not that far, from the East. I mean, just at the very beginning of the thing. And I'm not a deep student of this. We're getting into things that I haven't studied as deeply as, reincarnation cases and so on. But I'm convinced from my study of psychopaths and sociopaths, which is a separate area I'm interested in, that St. Paul, was not a saint, that he was a con artist. Therefore, Paul was not what he's cracked up to be. And his teachings, he brought in the Pharisee teachings, like, for example, the resurrection. He brought that in. And the resurrection is kind of a very bad substitute for reincarnation. So if reincarnation isn't there, what can we promise people? Well, we can promise them that they're going to sleep in the tomb as their as their flesh is decomposing and the worms are crawling around in there, they're sleeping. And then all of a sudden, when a trumpet sounds, they're all going to jump up and everybody physically is going to be who they were before. Well, it's utter nonsense. And this is one of the reasons that thinking people throw the whole thing out, the baby out with the bathwater. It's nonsense. When you put Vedanta and the preexistence of the soul and reincarnation back in where they belong. Reincarnation becomes very deep and very intellectually clear. It looks like nonsense because of these substitutions.
Maybe I should clarify for our audience. First of all, Vedanta is, please help me out, is like the groundwork of Eastern teachings.
It's the deepest Eastern teachings, yeah.
And most importantly, I wanted to mention to our viewers that you hold a degree in counseling, so you know what you're talking about. Is that right?
Well, theoretically, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the degree in counseling was very helpful to me when I worked on my documentary about reincarnation. I had interviewing skills, and I have a knowledge of psychology. As a matter of fact, I mean, I was always really good at the personality theory part of it, so that's my forte, really. But yeah, a master's degree is kind of the academic credentials that's just enough to get you in the door, I would say, to be respected by academia in general.
Let me mention your film. You're also a filmmaker, and you came out with a movie called In Another Life, Reincarnation in America.
Yeah, I started that in 1997. I had a little video production company at the time, one-man business, and I used my own equipment. I traded out for services. I had a little bit of donations, not very much, and it took me about 5 years. And although I had a pretty good understanding of reincarnation from my Eastern studies, I knew nothing about research that was being done in the Western society. So I started from scratch being educated. Ran into Dr. Ian Stevenson's work and the work of Carol Bowman here in the United States, and Dr. Roger Wolger, who was a Jungian past life therapist, and was able to interview most of them and put together an introduction, really, to reincarnation. But it was an introduction with the assumption that I was talking about a real phenomenon. It was not about the idea or the concept or the belief in reincarnation. It was about the phenomenon of reincarnation. So I started out right at the beginning, and I hit the viewer immediately with Dr. Stevenson's work for that reason, to establish we're talking about something real that's been verified scientifically. And from there, I went on to the different ways that Americans were encountering it, which includes spontaneous memories and past life therapy and Eastern teachings and the various different ways that one might encounter it. So it was basically designed as an overview of how are we encountering this actual phenomenon.
You mentioned the late Dr. Ian Stevenson. Could you elaborate on this a little bit? What was his work, and how do you see your film contributing to his work, or maybe as an addendum to his work?
Well, first off, his credentials are important. He was a pediatric psychiatrist, so he was very well qualified. And he was interested in a number of paranormal, call it paranormal phenomena. But in particular, he got interested in this phenomena of young children, many of whom were in India or Eastern countries, who seemed to have very accurate recall of their past lives, unusually accurate. And many people have a few glimpses or feelings or deja vu experiences, but these kids remembered just about everything. So he would go and interview their parents. He would try to find out what statements the child had made, and documented statements, if possible, written down, before they had any possibility of learning about this past life by normal means. Typically, it would be a little town that was, 100 miles away or something, that they had no normal way of knowing about. They would know, first off, they would be emotionally involved. They would say, I want to go to my real parents. You're not my real parents. And they would have traits like they'd be in a family that ate meat, and this kid would say, I'm a Brahmin, I don't eat meat, and that kind of, he would say that, I worked in a milk store or a store, and had such and such a name, and this was my house, and these were my parents, and, he would, all these details. And sometimes there were some very specific details, like this is how I died. And one of them is like, the money is buried here. And one of them says, my name is scratched on the back of the door. I mean, this is specific, idiosyncratic details. So finally, the kid would bug their parents, and they did not want the child to remember these things, because in at least some rural Indian cultures, it was bad luck. So they would do things like put the child on a potter's wheel and spin him backwards to punish him, to stop him from remembering. They didn't want it, in other words, which is crucial because skeptics will claim that there was some benefit for the child. Well, there's no benefit at all. As a matter of fact, it was painful for the child and it was painful for the parents because the child is saying, you're not my parent. So that's emotionally painful. So finally they take him back. Somebody takes him back. And I think in one or two cases, it was with Stevenson or his colleagues observing. Sometimes it wasn't. And there was no perfect case, I think. No, the perfect case is the parents had dated and written down the statements before the child was taken to the place, and Stevenson was there to watch the child go to the town for the first time. Well, all those elements weren't always in place. So he did the best he could. And he tried to be his own worst skeptic. He always tried to shoot down, to find a normal explanation for it. So he's his own worst skeptic. So they go to the town. The child leads them through the streets to the house. If there's some mistake, like the house has been moved, he says, oh, it's been moved over here. He knows exactly. He knows where his bedroom was. He knows. It turns out his name was scratched on the back of the door. Turns out the money used to be buried in there, but somebody found it. Everything checks out. 40 statements. And Dr. Tucker, the successor to Dr. Stevenson, told me when I interviewed him that there was a young girl who accurately remembered 25 first names from her past life. Not 3 or 4, which would be enough, but 25. So the point is that he has, although all he would say is that my results are suggestive of reincarnation, he was speaking as a scientist. Scientists don't talk about proof. They talk about statistics and they talk about averages and they talk about whether something is suggestive or, they don't claim proof. So he didn't use the P word. But when he says suggestive, the other person looking at his data is supposed to say, no, he proved it. Because logically he did prove it. So that's the significance of Stevenson's work. Now, I'm not convinced that those were normal cases. Personally, I think that those children had that kind of complete recall because they didn't go through the full process, which involves forgetting everything. In other words, those children, some of them were earthbound. And one of them describes, I was sitting on top of a palm tree, and I saw my future mother walk by and I said, I want to be born to her. And he went down into her stomach. See, that's what he described. So he wasn't in the Bardo realm or the astral plane or whatever we would call it. Those people were earthbound and they didn't go through what the Greeks called the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. They didn't go through that process. And I would theorize that's why they have that kind of recall. So Stevenson's results are very useful to prove that reincarnation is a real phenomenon. They may not be that useful to explore what the normal process is, because I don't think most of those subjects went through it.
So he was employing all the methods that we know in the West: logic, reasoning, like hard facts, subjective facts, no voodoo or of any kind, no esoterics as they often call it. He was like a downright scientist, and he went about the whole endeavor in a downright scientific way with scientific methods, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only real defense that I've seen that skeptics have boils down to it can't possibly be true, so therefore it's not true.
So they're ignoring.
They can't really poke holes in his actual work, especially if they read it. I mean, if they just read about it, then you have to take it to what Carol Bowman was doing, which was she became a kind of an advocate for parents whose children were telling them about a past life. And the parents were very worried about it, and they didn't know what to do. They'd hear about Carol, and they'd go to her, and then she would kind of collect these cases. What she found is that it's not particularly unusual. Now, Dr. Stevenson's successor doesn't seem to agree with this because they kind of worked out their own statistics of how common they thought it was. And I think that may be true that for these children with very detailed recollection, it's not that common. But for a child to say, Mommy, when I was big, I changed your diapers or whatever, if the child reincarnated from a grandfather. When I was big, or, there's where the car went off the road and I died before, statements like that, that's not that uncommon. The problem is it gets ignored, you know. But actually there's, you know, if you get into chats and bulletin boards and things where people are sharing these things, there's a lot of people that have these reports.
So now we're talking from an adult's perspective, and we're presenting the facts as best as we know them, as best as they reported. But couldn't someone make the point to say that, you know, at a young age you're susceptible to all kinds of influences? They might have picked it; those children might have picked it up in the West. I'm talking about those later examples now in the West. They might have picked it up somewhere. Some other kid talked about it, and they found, you know, they were fascinated, and they would repeat it over and over and make themselves believe that the things were as they told their parents. Isn't that a possibility from your perspective?
It is, although they don't really do that, I don't think. But, you know, when the child indicates that they were their own grandfather or great-grandfather, and the parent sits down with a photo album, which the child has never seen before, and the child picks out, names people and picks out who he was, you know, from that photo album, we're now getting into a realm of evidence that's beyond just imagination.
So, in preparing the film, In Another Life, you were filming one of your contacts, Mr. Jeffrey Keane, who had a past life very recently, and you were filming him while he was being read by a psychic medium, telling him about his past life. And then in the course of making the movie, you came across information of an own past life of your own. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, actually, it was a couple years later. But when I completed the documentary, which was in 2003, and got it on one TV station, I also got it accepted by Films Media Group, which means it's distributed to universities. So there's a little bit of credibility there. It's been seen, or some portion of it has been seen by about 500,000 people on the viral versions had, until I got rid of them. So I got the documentary distributed in 2003. It was finished, and I did a few interviews. One of the interviews was an online interview on a website where she sent me the questions, and I emailed the answers back to her. And in and among those questions was the question of whether I remembered any of my past lives. And this is something I hadn't given a lot of thought about, but there are a few that I think I might have, you know, remembered. And among the 4 or 5 or 6 examples I gave was a pretty specific description of a 19th century, I said one of the Romantic poets, that's the way I put it. And I said that he was not one of the famous ones, but that he was on the periphery of the famous ones. So that's something that just kind of sat there, and it's a matter of public record. You can go into archive.org in their Wayback Machine, and you can find that still. So it's not something I could have tampered with. It's on the internet. And that is a perfect description of the person I ran into by accident about 2 years later. You want me to go into that?
Please.
Briefly? Yeah. Okay, so many years earlier, I had a psychic reading, and the woman had told me that she thought I had been a female writer who put out serials like once a week on the West Coast, and it sounded like about 1920 or 1930. So I was in the habit of just getting on the internet and looking for names of female writers that I thought might be familiar. One day I ran across one named Sarah Orne Jewett. Excuse me. But Sarah Orne Jewett was in the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, in Boston on the East Coast rather than on the West Coast of the 1920s. Still, when I got into the website for her, something about it felt very familiar. And I kind of let that sit on the back burner for a while. And finally, I wrote to Jeff Keane, the same fellow that I'd interviewed. And the reason I did that is that there was a number of synchronistic events that happened with me and Jeff. And I thought, well, maybe he's psychic, and maybe he, in some way, and maybe he can come up with it. So I sent him the website, and I said, this feels familiar, but I can't figure out why. And about half hour later, he sent me back an email with a link to the internal page on that website. And he said, I felt just drawn to this, you know, and it looks like you. And he was a humorist, you know, he says, I'm betting this was you. So I'm looking at the page. It's one of the members of Sarah Orange Hewitt's social circle. It's the younger brother of the poet, the Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, who I'd heard of. I didn't know anything about him, but I'd heard of him. It said he was an author. It gave his birth and death dates, and that's all. I looked at the eyes in this portrait, which was like a 3/4 portrait, and immediately I felt I was looking at myself. I was looking into my own eyes. It was that strong, and that I knew nothing about him, never heard of him before. So that's how it started. Everything went from there.
Let's just go back to Jeffrey Keane once more. He is one of the characters in your documentary about reincarnation. He's one of the main people there that you interview. So he was sitting down in a psychic reading. Psychics meaning clairvoyant people who claim to have connection to spirits and who can communicate like a medium, we call it. He was sitting down with a person, and you were filming that, and then later on you seemed to become interested in that. What sparked that interest? I mean, you were just shooting a movie, but then you became more interested yourself personally.
Well, I can't really say what I thought I was going to prove by using a psychic. I hadn't really thought it out clearly. But I'm glad I did in this particular case, because she immediately starts out at the very beginning of she gives an invocation, and right after the invocation, she says something to the effect, I see you crawling behind enemy lines, you have a gun, and she says, boy, do I feel like it's France, So, but as I'm filming this, and I didn't stop, I didn't edit, this is just like straight untouched video. As I'm filming this, I know that he had given me unpublished manuscript before I started this, which she knew nothing about. She didn't know anything about him. She got his name and his birth date as part of the introduction, but I didn't tell her anything about him at all. He had written about something very similar to this. He'd written about being a British fusilier behind enemy lines in France in World War II. So she immediately gets, and she wasn't getting the one I wanted, which was a Civil War lifetime, but she got a more recent one, and it was dead on, and I had the proof of it. So I think at that point I did realize, oh my gosh, I knew it was real, but I said, I know it can be researched. I know I can research it. And the same thing happened when I was trying to find a case of a child with memories. I was able to network myself to one. It's not that uncommon. I was dating someone who was in the childcare industry. They put the word out and got me in touch with a parent, and I went and filmed, and so it is possible to prove it if you are willing to put the effort into it and believe it's possible.
You noticed how this woman and the more legitimate psychics or clairvoyant mediums claim that, or actually require you to give them as little information as possible beforehand so that they can't be influenced. She didn't have much or any information other than Jeffrey Keane's name and birth date, and that was it, basically. Am I right about that?
That's correct. And she made other hits too. She described him, she talked about a general, which he was, and she described him being in a situation where he was very worried about the men under his command, which he'd not only experienced as a general, but he was a assistant fire chief. So he had experienced that as an assistant fire chief. So, I mean, she was right on the money all the way down the line.
So you're saying it's almost like you were testing her account. You went in there, she had no information, and you were looking for a different piece of information, and she was actually corroborating something that Jeff had already put it down in a manuscript that you happened to know prior to this session, but she didn't know. And it was almost like she got information that you didn't want her to have, but she had it anyways. So there must have been something going on there which she was not involved with. Am I right?
Well, I think that mediums like that work with a team of people on the other side, and they make a decision as to what is permitted to come through, and what their criteria are for what's permitted and what isn't permitted. I'm not totally clear, but I think there are rules and regs up there, and I also think that they tend to give you things that you're not expecting. For example, if you look at some of the mediumistic readings by Gordon Smith and people like that, online, you might find that they won't give you a first name, they'll give you a middle name or a nickname. You know? So in other words, not the thing you're actually looking for, because that's too easy. That looks like fraud, or it just, you know, but they'll give you something that you weren't actually thinking about or looking for.
So it almost sounds as if you were a skeptic a little bit yourself, going into the shooting of the movie, and this experience that Jeffrey Keane there had with this medium kind of must have, I wouldn't say turned you around, but it got you more deeply interested in the phenomenon, and then you sat down with a lady yourself and got the information that you were this female writer. You were looking for the information on this female writer on the West Coast, didn't find it, came across someone else.
Well, it's like somebody panning for gold. You know there is gold, but you kind of are skeptical that you could actually find any. So this was kind of like going down to the stream with my little pan, you know, and I'm like, you know, no way I'm going to find any gold. And suddenly there's a nugget sitting there. You know, that convinced me I can actually do this myself. You know, I could actually prove this myself.
And then you came across the younger brother of John Greenleaf Whittier. Let's talk about that for a minute. How did this happen? You were looking for information for a female writer in the 19th century, didn't find it, came across someone else, and what happened then?
Well, I looked at that picture and I said, that's me. I'm looking at myself. So I was able to find, I was able to get through interlibrary loan a biography. It was a student thesis published in 1941 here in Maine. And I also found a little information about John Greenleaf Whittier's childhood, which of course would have included his brother, his younger brother. And that's in the Life and Letters of John Greenleaf Whittier. So I got both of them through interlibrary loan fairly early, like within a month or so of seeing this picture. And what that means is that anything that's in either of those two sources are kind of spoiled as far as research is concerned, because I might have gotten anything I think I remember that's in there, I could have gotten it from reading them, right? Because that was before I was trying to do any formal research. But they're wrong. They're like flagrantly, horribly wrong about Matthew. So when I started remembering things that were contrary to what was in there, now it gets interesting, because can I prove that my memories are right and those sources are wrong?
We're talking about memories as the writer, author, poet Mathew Franklin Whittier, the younger brother of John Greenleaf, and you said the image when you found it on the internet, it was like as if you were looking into your own eyes. So you're saying, do I get you right? You're saying that you're the reincarnation of this person? Is that what you're saying to me?
Well, at first I wasn't sure. You know, for maybe the first year or two, I wasn't sure. And I would call it the proposed case. You know, I tried to be careful. Finally, I had so much evidence, such overwhelming evidence, that I just say that I am. But I didn't start out with it as kind of a fond idea, as a megalomaniac, you know, that I have assumed this. It's not like I went and looked for somebody that looked like me and just assumed his identity, you know. It took me a while before I was convinced. But yeah, I'm absolutely convinced at this point.
How did you become convinced? You found more evidence. How did this happen?
Well, it was, first off, I have to explain that when I say memories, I'm talking about different levels or different types. So the first thing that I experienced was what I call recognition memory. And I feel that that's a very basic type of memory. And it comes through more readily than other types. So whereas I may not have the kind of memories that Dr. Stevenson's subjects had, you know, 25 first names and so on, I can recognize that level is still there. Emotions are still there. As a matter of fact, I'm convinced that emotions they're not blocked at all. Your past life emotions are constantly coming through and influencing you. So I had emotional recognition. And if the emotions are strong enough, cognitive memories can kind of come through with them. And I had that happen on a few occasions, and I was able to verify that they were historically accurate. Again, just like Stevenson's method, I was able to verify that they were correct, and they were things that I couldn't possibly have known before, and they were very specific. So it's basically the same method in some respects, except that mine are not coming through easily like those children. Mine are coming through where there was something very emotional. And I'll give you an example. Very early on, You know, this will also be an example of how strongly you can prove things, because sometimes you can prove things to a certain point, sometimes you can prove them flat out, but mostly it's to a certain level of plausibility. And then, you know, how many do you have like that? 20, 30, 40, you know, that are proven to a certain level. And when I say proof, usually proof admits of degrees. So I want to be clear about that. So when I read the Life and Letters of John Greenleaf Whittier, there was a little story about the two oxen, Butler and Blue or something like that they were named, and they were like pets for the children. The children would sit on between their horns, and there was a story about how they were sitting on this hill, and one of the oxen was running down the hill and he couldn't stop, so he jumped over the child to save his life. I had a very strong emotional hit as I was reading that. They slaughtered these oxen when Matthew wasn't there to stop it, or against his wishes or something. In other words, these were pets to him. And a lot of what is attributed to John Greenleaf Whittier may actually be Matthew. So to Matthew, they were pets. And apparently the family sold them for slaughter. That's what I felt. And he was very upset about it when he wasn't there. Well, it took me a long time to find any evidence for that. Finally, I found evidence of an auction that was given by the Whittier family. I believe this was probably in 1830 after their father had died, if I'm not mistaken. And in the list of things up for general auction are these two oxen. That means that anybody could have bought them for any purpose. And they were probably getting on in years. So that means that I haven't proven that they were slaughtered, but I have proven that the family did not make arrangements for them with somebody who would take care of them. They put them up at general auction where anybody who wanted to slaughter them for, you know, for meat or whatever could have bought them. So I proved it to a point. See, that was just one small example. That was the very first one, really, after seeing his photograph. But some of these things were stronger than that and very specific.
Please talk about those, the stronger evidence, because right now, you have to forgive me for saying that, but right now someone as a skeptic again might say, well, you were looking for something you wished to find, and then you found certain evidence and you pieced it together in the way that you appreciated.
Sure. Well, first off, with that one example, anybody could say that I was projecting my feelings onto what I was reading. But I can answer that because later on, much later, I found a great deal of Matthew's writing which indicates that he felt about animal cruelty exactly the way that I do. So it wasn't just projection. But I'll give you some of the strongest, or one or two of the strongest ones, and maybe we'll just give one. I mean, keep in mind that when I give these examples, there are others, you know, because the skeptical mind can always say, well, that's just one, you know, or if I give two, they could say that's just two. But keep in the back of your mind, Dr. Jim Tucker, the successor to Dr. Stevenson, who told me about the little girl with the 25 first names. Okay, so if we have the 25 first names, this is a real phenomenon. Okay, so it is not at issue whether this is possible, because that's Stevenson's work and Dr. Tucker's work. They've already proved it's possible. Okay, so you have to look at these in the context not of I am skeptical about the phenomenon itself, because that's now logically out. Now we're talking about, did I replicate it in my study? Because we know somebody else has done it. And actually, there are many other examples. Okay, so I'm in hypnosis, and not all of these happened under hypnosis. Some of them were not, but this particular one I was. And I don't remember the question that I was asked that might have prompted this, but I had a vision. And in my vision, I'm Matthew. I am in a wide open space, which I take to be Portland, Maine, where I live now, because I knew that he'd lived there. And it's a wide open area, and there are men, no women or children, just men, or almost all men, in top hats and black coats. They're wandering and milling around in this big open area. They're not standing and looking at any one thing. And there's quite a few of them. And at the far end of this gathering is somebody standing on a farm wagon with a megaphone, and he is trying to give a speech, but it's quite a long distance away, and most of the people aren't paying any attention to him. And I have a strong feeling and a thought, which is typical. I usually get like one strong emotion and a thought that comes with it, right? So my thought is a cynical thought, and it's like, oh, well, we'll see about that, you know. And that's actually, I would say that's the feeling, is the feeling of cynicism and of saying, well, we'll see. And the thought was that something really important was happening in a distant location. It wouldn't be affecting us where we were right away. We weren't in immediate danger, but it was going to mean big changes. And that's all I knew. So maybe a year or two later, I found a photograph of what was then called Congress Square in Portland, Maine, and I recognized the buildings in the background. Later, I found out that those buildings were there. So I was recognizing the buildings, and I said, that's where this took place.
And you had seen these buildings in your vision?
Yeah. I recognized them as the buildings that were in the background when I had my vision. And I found out later that they were there. Historically, that's correct. And then I was reading a book about Portland that was written in the 19th century. And I came across a sentence that said that there was a large meeting that was attended by the whole city. That's what it said. And it gave the date, which was January 26, 1861. Well, I'm not a big student of the Civil War. I really don't know a lot about the Civil War. I didn't know what that date was, but I put it into a search engine. And I came up with what was called the Great Union Meeting in Portland, and it described it. It was on the occasion of the southern states announcing that they were seceding from the Union of the United States. It was to address that issue. And there was several more points that are corroborative that go along with this that I won't go into, but the point was that my thought and my feeling were exactly on target. And that was that, well, I do have to go into a little bit of the meeting. The papers reported that the conservatives were running the meeting. It was stacked with the conservatives, and the conservatives were all wanting to be conciliatory towards the South. Please don't leave, we'll make concessions, and they were saying, oh, we'll make them happy and they won't leave the Union. Matthew was a radical abolitionist. So his response to that would have been, oh, well, we'll see. And in fact, he lampooned it in the paper later in his comic writing. And the fact that there was something at a distant place that was happening that could mean big changes, but it wasn't an immediate threat, was absolutely on target. Now, the meeting was an invitation of all the voters of the city. Only men could vote. And that explains why there were only men and no women and children. The place of the meeting was the City Hall, which held 2,500 people, but there would have been at least twice that who came out for the meeting. And the paper description says it was filled to overflowing. In Portland, there are 2 town squares. They were used for stump speeches. And logically, all the people that couldn't get in, like 2,500 at least men that couldn't get into the meeting, would have gravitated to the town squares where there would have been, like the radicals, the liberals would have been giving their own stump speeches because they weren't allowed on the platform in the conservative meeting in town hall. So that explains the guy up on the farm wagon. It also explains why a lot of people weren't paying any attention, because not all those people were liberals. A lot of them didn't really care to hear this guy. See, so it matches on every single point, Now, is that proof? Like I said, proof admits of degrees, but that's probably one of the strongest in my study.
So if I get you right, if we come back to Dr. Ian Stephens again and his cases in the Far East of children, it's not so different from that, right? These children start speaking and they talk about things from their previous lives. Now, the only difference with you being that there's a wider span, more time has passed between apparently in the 19th century and the 21st. But the method is not so different, right? You had these hunches. You were looking. You were your own skeptic, and you were going about the research from a skeptical point of view. You were looking for data, for actual factual data, to corroborate your hunches, your feelings. Because again, someone might say, and you said it yourself, you may have projected this, you may have projected things on your own emotions, but this goes beyond it. You then found evidence in the records, as you just said, with this example with the town square and the gathering.
It hits on 5 or 6 unique points that I had no way of knowing. And this is what is really crucial to bring out here, and that is that Dr. Stevenson was trying to answer the skeptical objection that's called cryptomnesia, which is false memory. And that is that if you take an adult and put him under hypnosis and he starts to remember the details of a certain war that happened in the 1600s and so on. But then you find out that he either did read or could have read a novel that has all these details in it. He had absorbed these facts and forgotten about them. And when he starts remembering them, he thinks they're from a past life, but they're really just from something he read or a film that he watched. That's the primary reason that Stevenson decided to study these children, because they had not read the books. They hadn't seen the movies. There was no internet at the time, and they had no possible way of knowing these facts. They hadn't been to that village. They didn't know where the house was. They didn't know the family. They didn't know that he worked in the milk business. They had no way of knowing any of these things. In my case, I defeated the cryptomnesia objection a little differently, because I stumbled upon a past life personality that nobody knew anything about, or if they knew anything about him, it was wrong. So there was no possible way that I could have previously known what I later uncovered about him. I call it the deep historical record, which means the historical record that you can't find unless you dig for 10 years like I did. So I knew nothing about these union meetings. I didn't know anything really about the Civil War, but I certainly didn't know about the details of that particular meeting. You know, I knew some of the things, like I knew that women didn't vote. You know, I knew that men wore top hats, you know, but I didn't know all of these things. And this is true for some of the other examples also, that there was no possible way. So in my own way, I've defeated the cryptomnesia objection, because there was no way that I could have known any of these details any more than the children in Stevenson's study.
Okay, so you mentioned hypnosis as a method. One could say again, I mean, hypnosis we know is a method where the subconscious is highly susceptible to suggestion. What makes you certain that the information that surfaces from that yields valid results? I mean, you were talking about the reference in the deep record, deep history, which you can't find anywhere else. So a skeptic might say again, I mean, if you can't find information on that, who's to say it's just made up?
First off, the proof is in the puffing. If I can prove it, if I can validate the memories, it doesn't matter how I got them. I could have picked them up out of a trash can. If I picked those 5 or 6 memories out of a trash can and validated them, something weird is going on. You have to chalk it up to synchronicity or something, but something supernormal or paranormal is going on. So if I got them from hypnosis, or I got them from a trash can, or I remember them spontaneously, it doesn't matter, if I could verify them. Secondly, my personal experience of hypnosis, which I didn't go very deep, I was not able to achieve a very deep level, but occasionally I dipped down. And what I experienced subjectively was that I was fully conscious, I was fully aware of my surroundings, and I was in complete control. I could choose to agree with the hypnotherapist's suggestions or not. And I was very careful about that. I only reported what I experienced. And I refused to allow myself to be suggestible in any way. And that may be why I didn't go very deep. I don't know, but that's my training, and that's the way my mind works. So what would happen is that suddenly some memory would come bubbling up, just like it does during our normal waking consciousness. I would suddenly remember something, it would come bubbling out of my unconscious or my subconscious. And strangely enough, some of those I was able to verify, in the deep historical record. So, you'd have to evoke chance. If you want to call that imagination, you have to say that I imagined some scene that actually took place in Portland, Maine, at the place that I remembered it happening exactly like the description, and it's very unlikely. But again, remember that the possibility of remembering a past life is not at issue. If it is, if anybody thinks that's at issue, they are fooling themselves. It's not rational, because Stevenson's work has proven that this can actually be done. We got our 25 names, we got our names scratched on the back of the door. That's a done deal. You have to approach it with the preconception that this is possible, because it's already been proven to be possible. So then it's not such a stretch at that point. The reason is that skeptics are still fighting the first battle. Logically, they need to be over that.
Well, these experiences, if you accept them as a real phenomenon, could it explain how people in this life suffer from so-called mental disorders that the mainstream has no other way of talking about? Would you want to elaborate on that for a minute? How do we set it apart from mental disorders? Are they one and the same? Or could it be that past life memories bleed out into this life and cause a lot of distress for the person involved?
Well, it depends on how you push these things. Conceptually, my understanding is, and was from before I even started on my documentary, that there's really only just one long life, punctuated by death and birth, with in normal cases with an interval in between for reflection. So of course these things follow and are cumulative. It just makes perfect sense. They don't just go away. They follow you into the next incarnation until they get resolved, and the situations keep repeating, and the issues keep repeating. What it means is that there is no such thing as post-traumatic stress syndrome, which does not include past lives. Basically, it's all because you have way more than just the one life. So it's an illusion to just look at the one life and isolate it and look at it in isolation. It can't be looked at in isolation. So of course these things follow. Now, I do think that these children were an abnormal case, but I don't think it's an abnormal case in the reductionistic sense that it's just from this one life. But I do think it's abnormal. So that usually, apparently Stevenson found that many of these children remembered a traumatic death. So apparently there's something about a physically traumatic death that tends to lead to this kind of recall. And they would have fears that relate. If the child had drowned in the river, they were afraid of the river. If they'd been run over by a train, they'd be afraid of trains. If they were killed by some person that was still alive, they were afraid of that person. It just makes perfect sense. It's taking reincarnation out of the picture. The problem is, if you take reincarnation out, there's a big hole left in there conceptually, a huge hole, because it's connected to other things, which are connected to other things, which are connected to other things. So it's like taking an organ out of the body, but that organ is connected, has tendrils, and is connected to a lot of other things. So when you rip this thing out, a whole bunch of other stuff comes out, and you have to completely reconfigure to fill in that hole, which means you have to come up with some kind of a delusional system which explains how there could be only one lifetime. You have to do that morally, you have to do that religiously, and you have to do that psychologically. And what we have in religion, in our morality and our ethics, and in science is a huge delusional system that has been built up to try to explain everything in the world without reincarnation, especially when you take out the pre-existence of the soul and the soul altogether. Because first they took out the pre-existence of the soul. Now you have a soul that's supposed to be created at birth. Well, that's very easy to go from there to no soul at all. See, so first off, we take out the pre-existence of the soul, and then we take out the soul. And now you have what I would call a delusional system, which tries to explain what a person is and what the world is without the soul. So it goes deeper than reincarnation, but reincarnation is certainly an important part of it. And it's an especially important part of it because it can be proved, objectively proved. See, so once you prove reincarnation, you've got the pre-existence of the soul back. And then the whole thing comes in. See?
So we might say that Western scientificism, as it's sometimes called, Western dogma, is on the wrong track.
Fatally flawed.
Okay. Yeah. Past life trauma, we should also mention that it's not just psychological trauma, which is widely misunderstood. When people talk about trauma, they mistake it for just emotional impact. But it goes beyond that. It has a physical impact on the nervous system, and sometimes there's even physical evidence that a person died from, let's say, a gun wound, a gunshot, and it's still in this life, their body has a mark somewhere in that place where the where the bullet hit them. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the most fascinating things that Stevenson found, and that is once he had confirmed an actual reincarnation case. So we've got with the descriptions that I've given. And I want to bring out quickly that not only were there factual things that the child remembered, but their emotions were also appropriate. So when they were brought to their former family, they relate to their little sister as a little sister, and they relate to their wife as a wife. This little kid is relating to his past life wife as a wife. And, in language, there's certain terms that you use, for certain levels. So they're using the right term for a wife and not what a little child would address an older woman. So there's the emotional aspect as well. So what he found, once he had established through all these other methods that it's a real case, he found out how the child died, and then he looked for birthmarks on the child, and the child would have birthmarks that correspond to the violent death that they had. So there's one example that sticks in my mind. This child remembered, I think he was running a video store or something. I can't remember, it might be another case, but he was running a store, I think. He was shot with a shotgun in the chest. And Stevenson was able to find who that person was, and he found the autopsy report. So there's a drawing, there's a human torso, and there's a drawing of where all the pellets hit this guy in the chest. This child has marks on his chest that match the autopsy. And remember, they've already confirmed that it's a reincarnation case, and there's several of them. If the child is shot here, there's an entrance wound and an exit mark, that correspond, and so on. So then there's phobias and so on, but the actual, what it means is that the mind is capable of fashioning the body. Now there's two things that I want to go with here. The first is that one of the people that I interviewed was a past life therapist, a Jungian therapist named Roger Wolger, who's passed on now. And when I interviewed him, he talked about a case where he would give these workshops, which I attended in order to interview him. And he would regress people, not with hypnosis, but through association. He used Gestalt association techniques. And this person was remembering the life of a witch who had been hung for being a witch. And while she was in the emotions of remembering this and relating it, suddenly a rope mark appeared on her neck, and like 20 people that were part of that saw it.
In that moment?
At that moment, as she was recalling it, the rope mark very clearly appears on her neck, see?
Oh.
Well, what that tells us, at the very least, it tells us that the subconscious mind is able to influence the skin. We know that for sure, okay? And there's deeper possibilities there. Now look at somebody like Jeff Keane. Jeff Keane is almost an identical physical match for his previous life as John B. Gordon, the Civil War Southern general. He's so close, I would call him like 97% match. And there's people that have actually overlaid it and everything. And then I'm also a very close match for Matthew Franklin Whittier. I'm probably 85 to 90% anyway, and I'm not the only one. There's quite a few others like that. So it may not be a universal thing, but many times the person is a very close match. And there's no genetics. So far as I know, I'm not genetically in any way related to the Whittier family. Jeff says he's not in any way genetically related to the Gordons, and so on. So what we call genes, and I think we use quote unquote genes as a catch-all category, to dump everything we don't understand. And if we don't understand it, call it genetic. We don't really know what that means, but we'll call it genetic because it saves our materialism, basically. But this cannot be genes. And yet you've got an identical person who has the other signs of being a past. In other words, I'm just like Stevenson, I've got other ways that I can show that I was Matthew Franklin Whittier, but then there's the face, and Jeff Keane the same way. He's got other ways that he can show that he was John B. Gordon, but then he looks identical, So there's definitely something going on where the mind is able to create the physical body. Now that has incredible implications, because any kind of chronic illness, or what we would call a genetic predisposition, could be not genetics at all. Or if it's genetics, it could be the mind working through the DNA. In other words, the DNA is not the final cause, it's an intermediary, whereas the mind is the actual agent. That means it creates the brain. That means it creates the brain chemistry. So we're way off with this genetics thing. Genetics is just the intermediary. It's the mind that's creating. So let's suppose that somebody, maybe 700 years ago, they get into the habit of going to the pub and drinking. and having a great time with the guys and singing songs and telling stories. And it's a wonderful experience. And he does it maybe every week or two. Next lifetime, he's drawn to that, and he does it every 2 or 3 days. Next lifetime, he does it all the time. Next lifetime, he has to drink even when he's at home, you know, and he uses it to solve his problems and dull his feelings and whatever. Pretty soon, he's incarnating with a body that needs alcohol, with a predisposition. Not only with the mental predisposition, but with a physical body that needs alcohol. This is not genetic, primarily. This is reincarnation. Now, this is the reincarnation studies of the future. This is the science and the psychology of the future, which takes reincarnation into account. And it's going to be vastly more sophisticated than what we have now. So what I'm doing is just a pioneering study. I'm just trying to get the basics, the ABCs of this thing. There are much deeper implications that flow from all of this.
Well, basically, Western mainstream got it the wrong way. We're trying to nail it down to materialist, objective facts. When
one of the people I studied, one of the saints I studied, Swami Vivekananda, used to say, not from bad to good, but from good to greater good. So science was attempting to develop a systematic means of avoiding the error of superstition. They were trying to develop a system whereby people would remain objective and logical and would find the truth and seek the truth. It requires honesty. It requires pure motives, you know, it requires ethics. Without that, and it really requires an understanding of spirituality, which in the 19th century it had, you know, but we've lost that. We've also lost the ethics and we've lost the motive. So now science, anybody lies about their results according to who's sponsoring them. See, so we've lost it. It's corrupt now. It also became materialistic. It was not originally. And a Swami that I interviewed for my program pointed out to me that there were 2 men in the 19th century who were researching evolution. One of them was Charles Darwin, and one of them was Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace was a spiritualist. He had a spiritual perspective, but according to the Swami, his findings were not published because the publishers thought they'd make more money with Charles Darwin. So Wallace was ignored, and Darwin, the materialist, became popular, and out of him came the idea of social Darwinism, and out of that came a great deal of exploitation and some awful, you know, so there's ripple effects because there are ethical implications in reincarnation also. You know, this doesn't affect just science, it also affects religion and it affects ethics and morality.
How do you think science and religion, spirituality can come back together? What is your take on that?
I think the soul has to be brought back in. So the point is that if spirituality is properly understood and not the distorted version that Paul brought in, and not the distorted version that's appeared in other religions. If it's understood properly, it's very logical, you know. The soul has to be brought in. The pre-existence of the soul has to be brought in. And then with that, an understanding of the relationship to God of the soul. And with all of that, a reinstating of the sacred, an understanding of what is sacred. Because the worst thing that's happened in secularized society is nothing is sacred anymore. And the other thing that has to be brought in is the understanding that thoughts are things, because we have the idea that thoughts are unreal. A mind is not real, thoughts are not real, and therefore morality has been separated from the mind. That was understood back in even the 19th century. It was understood that your thoughts, that morality also involved your thoughts. What happened is that got cheapened. Ignorant people got hold of that and said, oh, you're having sinful thoughts. And then the idea of sin comes in and people are being judged, and rational people just threw that whole thing out. Well, they threw the baby out with the bathwater because thoughts are real. And when you immerse yourself in negativity and immerse yourself in negative thoughts and encourage negative thoughts in yourself, you are creating something that's toxic. A toxic condition in yourself, And if on the collective level, the whole society becomes toxic. And that, I believe, spills out into the environment, not only in the obvious ways that the guy running the chemical plant is so boorish that he doesn't care about dumping into the, but I think that, I suspect that when we see earthquakes and tornadoes and volcanoes and things, that this is nature's, because nature is also mental and spiritual. So when we become mentally toxic and put this into the mental environment, that manifests down into the physical environment. When we understand the soul is real, then we understand that thoughts are real. When we understand thoughts are real, we understand that the sacred also impinges on the world of thought. And that a clean heart and a clean mind are not just something that you hear in Sunday school. This is practical. This is absolutely essential. And that we have lost a sense of the sacred, and we have lost a sense of purity. Purity is laughed at. Anybody talks about purity of heart, they're laughed at. It's absolutely essential. So this all comes back to reincarnation, because reincarnation is a thing that can be objectively proven. That brings in the pre-existence of the soul. That brings in the soul. That brings in the relationship to God. That brings in thoughts as real things. That brings in the sacred and purity of heart and mind. So I'm just aiming at that one thing. I keep blasting like a magnifying glass, trying to burn that one thing. See? That's why I keep focusing on that one thing.
You're making a very strong point for spirituality, for ethics, for the soul. You have your own experience as as a reincarnation of Mathew Franklin Whittier, which you put in a very large book, and you also have an accompanying book, which is called "In Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own World." You also released a document showing and demonstrating your scientific rigor and the methods that you used in digging up all this evidence. Do you want to mention these books before we wrap it up?
Yeah, the first two books, which are ebooks, they have to be because they're way too big. We're talking 2,400 pages and 700 pages. It happened because I kept finding evidence, and the evidence had to be fit in. And as I told you before, the thing that I finally decided to do is I'll tell the story of the research. In other words, instead of trying to fit everything into a chronological timeline, I'll just tell how I found what, when, and what I knew before I found it, and what memories I had already recorded that are confirmed and so forth. And I kept finding more and more and more and more. And you'd almost have to read the whole thing to really get the full impact of it. And for years, I resisted the idea of writing a summary, but I thought to myself, well, why would people not want to read these? It seems to me that they're worth immersing yourself in if you took it seriously. If I really did what I said I did, this is worth immersing yourself in, because people immerse themselves in that much material just for fun, for escapism, and they don't think a thing about it. But when it's something, like this that they don't believe in the first place, they can't get into it. Well, I thought, okay, I'll write a short book. So I wrote a book that's only 200 pages. It's a print book in case people have objections to ebooks. It's called Reincarnation Can Be Proven. And that you can order from Amazon. It's a print-on-demand book. And that summarizes, the evidence, the strongest of the evidence, and it gives you an overview of what I did, including the one or two examples that I talked about today.
So you've given us an account of your very impressive work, which comprises of a large body of work, and you just mentioned the books. Would you like to share what you're currently working on, what your outlook, your perspective is? Are there any future projects that you're involved with? Would you like to elaborate on those for a minute?
Well, of course, I'm still finding a few things every once in a while, meaning primarily Mathew Franklin Whittier's works. And it's something we haven't gotten into. What I found was that he was an anonymous writer who wrote under a great many secret pseudonyms. And I had to find them all, which took me 11 years to track them all down and prove that they were his and not somebody else's. And a lot of them were claimed by scholars after the fact for other writers, because nobody knew anything about him. The only thing they knew is that he wrote one satirical series, and that's it. Whereas I found maybe 2,200 of his published works now. But I have to get people interested in it, and I have to get people to take it seriously. And no matter how open-minded they try to be, there's really only two sides to this. Either you do believe me or you don't. And if you don't, it's just not interesting enough to go into. you know, in that depth. If you do, it's more than worth it, you know. And the second one is that people somewhere deep down inside, they know this is real, but it scares the crap out of them.
So you collected this large body of work. Anyone wanting to believe it, drilling it down to faith, or not wanting to believe it, they're going to find plenty of information to corroborate what they're looking for. Mr. Sakellarios, thank you very much for taking the time and elaborating on some of your work and giving us some detail and background on it all. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on, giving me the opportunity.